Hi everyone, my name is Lena Casanos and I will be moderating today's webinar. I will begin by introducing the Capital Pathways program, then I will introduce myself and give the word to our guest speaker, Tammy Hoy, attorney at the Geller Law Group, who will introduce herself and take us through a presentation on legal entity structures. Feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A function throughout the presentation. We will be responding to them after each main section. The questions that we cannot respond to in this webinar, we are happy to address through our no-cost one-on-one services or connect you to resources that can help. We will share a recording and slides of this webinar afterwards. So what is the Capital Pathways Program? The Capital Pathways Program is a program funded by the U.S. Treasury SSBCI initiative, sponsored by the Virginia Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity, and hosted by the Virginia SBDC and George Mason University. We can start with the program overview, then we will go through the program eligibility and finalize with its services. Capital Pathways is a no-cost specialized SBDC program that helps small businesses build the systems and habits needed to become capital ready. Why does it matter? It matters because those less prepared self-select out or fail applications. Early failures correlate to lack of adequate capital. Higher cost alternatives don't build long-term capacity. Only half of requested amounts reach small businesses. To put things in perspective, about 25% of small businesses need access to financing for growth and preserving cash flow. However, just 20 to 30% of those who apply for loans actually get their loans approved. So, Capital Pathways creates a path to financial and legal readiness. Our program offers an immersive hands-on group experience paired with one-on-one support. Who is eligible? Very small businesses and nonprofits at any stage facing challenges accessing traditional financing. The services that we provide include guided self-assessment, legal structure validation, financial skills and tools, and loan application readiness. We start with a self-assessment that pinpoints your business key gaps so we can connect you with the right tailored resources either through our Capital Pathways program or other resources that can help. Under our legal structure validation, our in-house advisors can help you through more basic legal questions, and we partner with the Geller Law Group, which Tammy is part of, and can help you for more complex topics related to business registrations, trademarks, and contract and agreement reviews. We also offer financial webinars on topics including financial basics, financial statement preparation, and QuickBooks training. Another one of our offerings include one-on-one individualized and tailored support on business foundations, profitability and pricing, financial forecasting, financing options and readiness, financial statements and tools, and loan readiness and lender prep. Finally, our loan application readiness services include both webinars and one-on-one individualized support. The webinars are on topics such as what lenders look for in loan applications, interactive mock loan interviews, and sample application analyses, and webinars such as today's, not today's, but other webinars as well. We have a partnership with a lender that provides one-on-one support for those looking for capital. If you are interested in getting started, you can reach out through our website at Virginia SBDC program capital pathways, or you can reach out to me or our a program coordinator, Ali Johnson, and she will provide that information in the chat. Now over to introductions. As mentioned before, my name is Lena Castanos and I am today's moderator. I have a professional background in economic development, small business support, and access to finance projects domestically and internationally, and I am currently both a program lead and a business advisor in the Capital Pathways program. Today's session will consist of a 60-minute presentation. Again, feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation, and we will be responding to them after each main section. We will also leave some rooms for questions in the end. If we cannot get to your question in this webinar, we are happy to address through our no-cost one-on-one services or connect you to resources that can help. We will share a recording and slides of this webinar afterwards. Now I will give it over to Tammy to introduce herself and to tell us a little bit about her background and start her presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Everyone bear with me while I get my slides up. All right. Okay. How's it? How does that look?
Perfect.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lena, and to Capital Pathways for inviting me to speak today. I'm so happy to partner with this wonderful program and to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. I know we're kind of in a busy time right now, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and learn about structuring your business for growth. We'll talk about um, a few business structures today and what things to look out for as you grow your business. As Lena said, I am an attorney at the Geller Law Group. I am the chair of the business practice group there, and I serve small business and nonprofit clients in the Virginia, DC, and Maryland jurisdictions. We have a really great team of lawyers who also practice in family law, estate planning, and probate as well. So we can service many aspects of your busy life. I focus on business exclusively, and I also help with all the trademark matters that the firm handles. Without further ado, here is a disclaimer before I begin. As an attorney, I'm pretty much obligated to give this disclaimer. The presentation is made for informational purposes only. It's not intended to convey or constitute legal or tax advice, and it doesn't create an attorney-client privilege. It's not intended as a solicitation or all-inclusive statement of the law, and it's not a substitute for obtaining legal advice from a qualified attorney or tax advice from a CPA. There are a lot of general principles that we'll cover here, but every scenario might be different, and you'll want to get tailored advice to your specific situation and your specific business. So, jumping in, who this webinar is for. This webinar is for small business owners beyond their startup phase, businesses who are planning to scale or take on partners, owners seeking financing or stronger legal foundations, and small or growth ready businesses. If you're an entrepreneur and just starting out, this also can be helpful for you, but this is more geared towards people who have gotten their feet wet and have already started a business. So here's an outline of what we will cover today. First, we're going to cover entity choice of your business. And this is going to be the meatiest part of the presentation. We're going to cover why business structure matters for growth, the types of business entities that are available, the features of these common business entity types, and of course, tax considerations. And then we will also cover ownership agreements, liability and risk management, transitioning as you grow, lenders and investors and what they're looking for, some real world growth scenarios. I have examples here, but if you have questions, this is a great place to jump in because having some actual facts or questions that you're dealing with is a great way to discuss these topics in a practical way. And then we'll cover some key takeaways and then there'll be Q&A at the end. But as Lena mentioned, we can take Q&A as we go through the major topics in the presentation, just so it's fresh in your mind and we have a little bit of interaction and it's not just me talking the entire time. Okay, so we're going to jump into business entity choice. This is a really important decision for any business owner because the legal structure that you choose impacts your liability protection. It has tax implications. it can impact ownership and control over the business and its ability to raise capital. The right structure supports long-term growth, and the right structure for you might not be the right structure for another business in another entity, or excuse me, in another industry or in another phase in their business life cycle. It's really and the right structure for you right now might not be the right structure for you in the future. So it's good to know what the options are in terms of business entity structure and what implications there are when you make a certain choice for one over another. So we're going to cover some of the business entity types. These are common business entity types. Business entity types are created at the state level by state law. But these are very common across all jurisdictions. You have sole proprietorships, um, partnerships of different flavors. You can have a general limited or limited liability partnership. You can also have a limited liability company. There are also cooperative associations, non-stock corporations, and corporations. So today we're definitely not covering non-stock corporations, although that is an option that's available as a business entity type. It is a very different animal from for-profit. So while it is a choice, we're not going to cover that today. This is a chart with very small letters on it. Don't worry, you're going to get a copy of it. And I'm going to talk you through it. These are some common business entity structures. On the left-hand side, it starts with sole proprietorship. So across the top, in the teal color, are the business entity types. And on the left is the sole proprietor. And then on the very far right is a corporation, or also known as a C corporation. This kind of goes from the most simplistic type of business entity on the left with the sole proprietor to the most complex, which is the corporation on the right. So that's just one frame of reference for this chart. And then down the left-hand side in the dark gray boxes are different characteristics of these entities. So the ownership, there are different terms for what is an owner for each entity type. So for example, a sole proprietorship, the owner is the sole proprietor or owner. In a partnership, it's the partners who own the business. In a limited liability company, it's the members who own the business. In a corporation, it could be an S corporation or a C corporation. It's the shareholders who own the business. So keep in mind, these terms all mean the owners of the business, but depending on the entity type, you might encounter different terminology. Um, so that's the first box. And then down below that is the owner liability, and whether or not the extent of the liability of the owner under that business entity type. I'm not going to go through each one of these in this slide. I'm going to talk about them in more detail, but I'm just walking you through what this chart represents. Um, Down on the left-hand side again, the next category is whether it's separately taxable as an entity from its owner or owners, how it's treated at the federal tax level, and how it's treated for tax purposes at the state level, and then whether registration is required to create the entity, and the management of the business. So you can have different management structures and different governing bodies depending on the different entity types, and then how capital contributions are treated for each entity type. So these are just several of the categories where you could compare the different entity types. And going forward, I'm going to talk through some of these entity types in further detail, but this is just a reference slide. It's kind of nice so you can see the comparison on one page. So first, we're going to talk about the sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorships are a business that is owned by a single person. There's no registration required to create the business. You start a sole proprietorship by just beginning to do a business activity. It can be offering to sell goods or services in the marketplace. If the business operates using a name other than the owner's name, you do have to register a fictitious name so that for consumer awareness and regulation purposes, people know who is operating the business operating under a certain name. So while creating the business doesn't require registration, if you're operating um, under a fictitious name or a trade name or a business name that's not your own, you do have to register that. Um, Income from a sole proprietorship is reported on your personal tax return. A sole proprietorship is what's known as a pass-through entity, meaning income from your sole proprietorship business will pass through and be reported on your Form 1030, 1040 income tax returns. Here are some pros and cons of a sole proprietorship. Uh, the pros of having a sole proprietorship is that it's easy and relatively low cost to set up and operate. You can just start doing business. And the owner has 100% control and ownership of the business because there's only one person. The huge con and disadvantage of a sole proprietorship is that there is unlimited personal liability for the business activities that of the sole proprietor. So essentially, since you haven't registered a separate entity, a sole proprietorship means that your business and your personal assets are all in one bucket. So there's no separation of your business activities from your personal activities. Another business entity is kind of a step up from a sole proprietorship. It's a partnership. And this is just a business that is owned by two or more people. In the same way that a sole proprietorship doesn't require registration, a partnership also doesn't require registration to create the business. It is created by two or more people setting up a business and offering goods or services in the marketplace. In Virginia, a partnership may file a statement of partnership authority just to let the Virginia State Corporation Commission, which is the agency where you file your business entity documents, um, you would let them know that you're operating as a partnership. That is optional. The business name, because typically in a partnership, there's more than one owner, or there is one more than one owner in a partnership, rather, you should register a fictitious name or also known as a trade name or doing business as name for the partnership. And then similar to the sole proprietorship, income from the business is reported on the partner's individual personal tax returns. It's also a pass-through entity. I do want to note that there are different types of partnerships. A general partnership is the type where the partners have the same rights and responsibilities, and there's unlimited liability for all of the partners. A limited partnership it has limited liability for the partners who are considered limited partners and unlimited liability for people who are general partners. And then there is a limited liability partnership where that means there are no general partners and liability is limited for each of the partners individually. So um, these have different implications. Different industries have different ways of operating. So you might see law firms operate as a limited partnership or limited liability partnership, or other kind of professional service providers. Whereas, so those ones are a little bit more complex than a general partnership that can be started by just starting to do business. The pros of a general partnership is, again, it's easy and relatively low cost to set up and operate, similar to a sole proprietorship. And the owners have 100% control of the ownership of the business. Um, they share it among themselves, and it's all equal in a general partnership. The um, downside of a general partnership is similar to a sole proprietorship. There's unlimited personal liability for the business activities for general partners. So again, this means because there was no separate business entity created, all of the business activities of the owners are in the same bucket as the personal assets of the owners. So there's no separation for personal and business assets or liabilities. So what that means is if there was ever a claim against the business, then your personal assets could be reachable due to any claim. So those are all because they're all in one bucket. Um, the another downside of a partnership is that the partners can bind other partners to business decisions, and all partners can be held responsible for a decision or a professional um, decision or service that the other partner has provided. Partners can be liable for the negligence or malpractice of other partners as well. So going to the other side of the spectrum of complexity, if you're thinking back to that chart, we're on the right side of the chart where we have a corporation, which is the most complex type of business entity that we would be talking about today, and among the more common business entity types. A corporation is a legal entity that is separate and distinct from its owner or owners. It is incorporated and registered under state law by filing articles of incorporation. In Virginia, you file those with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. And the owners are called shareholders because they own shares of the corporation. It also needs to file its own corporate tax return. So it's none of the income is passed on to the owners to file on their personal tax returns. It is its own legal entity and in air quotes person that files its own tax returns. Some of the pros and cons of corporations. The big advantage of a corporation is that personal liability protection for shareholders. Um, is separate from its business activities. So because you've created this new entity by registering the entity and filing articles of incorporation, it's like creating a separate person. So all of your business activities are contained in this separate corporation. All of the assets and liabilities are separate from any one owner's or shareholders' personal assets. Um, so there is liability protection from claims due to business activities. The downside of a corporation business entity type is that it's more expensive to start and maintain. A corporation is the most complex type of business entity, and it has a complex governance structure, including shareholders and a board of directors. So there's already kind of additional layers of governing bodies that come into play. There are more corporate formalities to observe, like having shareholder or board meetings and then documenting all of that activity in corporate books and meeting minutes. And then another downside is that thing called double taxation. So as I mentioned before, a corporation has to file its own tax returns, so it'll file income taxes on its earnings. And then the shareholders, as owners, can get dividends or their share of the earnings from the business, and then they would be taxed on their earnings. So that's why there is what's known as double taxation. So it's kind of a downside. There's two layers of tax. The last type of business entity that I'm going to cover is a limited liability company. So this is kind of a newer business entity that came into existence. It was invented in the 1980s. And uh, it's not a business entity type that is available internationally. Sometimes we'll be working with with lawyers from other countries and they don't understand what a limited liability company is because they don't have that there. Um, a limited liability company is a very flexible entity type. It kind of combines some features of a sole proprietorship and on one side in terms of tax pass through to the owners, but then it takes the limited liability aspects of a corporation and it puts them into one entity. So I kind of think of it as a hybrid entity. A lot of small businesses are formed as limited liability companies because they are so flexible, and they're not as complex and don't require as many corporate formalities. So a limited liability is still considered a legal separate entity from its owners. You create it by filing articles of organization with the state agency. The owners are called members who own membership interests in the LLC, rather than shares like in a corporation. You can have a single member LLC or a multi-member LLC. So it is the same entity type, regardless of whether you have one member or more members. It's still considered a limited liability company. It combines, as I said, the liability protection of the corporation and the pass-through taxation of the sole proprietorship slash partnership. Um, and so the default tax structure is that income from the business is going to be reportable on each member's personal income tax returns. So I alluded to this already. The big pro of having a limited liability company or an LLC is personal liability protection for the members for their business activities. So you're creating a separate bucket for your business activities from your personal assets. Um, it is less in terms of cost to start and maintain than a corporation. It has a very flexible business structure and management, and there are fewer corporate formalities than you have with a corporation. And you can choose a tax classification. Some of it is by virtue of how many owners you have, but then there are other elections that you can make, like the S-Corp election or C-Corp election, even uh, if that's beneficial to you and what the way that you want to go. Um, so there aren't that many cons, and this was a little bit of a stretch. It is a little bit more expensive to start up than a sole proprietorship or a partnership because you do have that registration and then you need to maintain it and keep it alive. So keep that registration active and in good standing. But I think the liability protection is worth the cost to create the entity and maintain it because the liability protection and separating your personal and business assets is so important. Um, I'm gonna pause there to see if there are any questions at this point before we jump into tax classifications and how they relate to business entity type.
Thank you, Tammy. It does look like we have a couple questions already submitted, and I see one participant who has their hand raised. Just a reminder to folks, if you could please submit your questions using the Q&A feature, and we will get to them as appropriately as we can or as quickly as we can. So our first question is from a participant who is in an LLC with 4 owner members, and they file taxes as an LLC. Their question is, are there options or an option to lower taxes, specifically looking at like self-employment taxes?
Yes. So lowering taxes. First and foremost, I am not an accountant. So while I am Asian, math is not actually my favorite subject. So that's why I became a lawyer. But um, when it comes to tax, I definitely refer to or defer to the CPAs of the world, and how you can take advantage of tax savings. That is definitely their department. We'll talk a little bit about the tax classification coming up. So that is one way that you could potentially um, be more efficient in terms of tax liability. But then the, hmm, I think it also depends on, operations and how much, business expenses you have that you can write off against revenue and have to pay taxes on. But that is a very strategic question that you would be best to talk to a CPA about. So I'll leave it at that because I'm going to talk about the tax classification coming up.
And we do have some CPAs and tax professionals on staff, and they can help you with your specific situation. It is very specific to your business, what makes the most sense tax-wise. And we did have two webinars this month on taxes and how to lower your taxes. So if you are interested in those recordings, feel free to reach out to Ali in her email that was provided, and we would be very happy to send those over to you.
Great, thanks, Lena.
All right, on to the next question. It's from a participant who is in a currently a single owner LLC looking to add a partner and become an LLC partnership starting at the beginning of the year. And they have two questions. First one is, will they need to get a new EIN? And the second one is, what do they need to do besides send in a form saying their ownership is changing?
So, okay. Um, Two-part question. So the new EIN question, yes, you do need to get a new EIN because your business structure is going to change. Um, there is a handy page on the IRS website that answers is basically it says at the top, do I need a new EIN? And so this is one of the scenarios because you're going to be taxed as a sole proprietorship to being taxed as a partnership. The IRS likes to have a new EIN for you in that circumstance. And then the second question is about whether you need to send in a form to um, update anything. I'm gonna make an assumption that this question is directed at the forms for the Virginia SEC or wherever your entity is registered. Typically, no. Um, the ownership, I mean, the entity is basically the shell, and there's no distinction between a single member LLC versus a multi-member LLC when at the registration with Virginia SEC. Whether, how many partners you have or how many members the LLC has is going to be handled in your operating agreement. So you would need to update that, but that's an internal agreement that you don't need to file anywhere. Great question.
Thanks, Tammy. All right, so our next question is actually from two different people who have similar questions. So I'm going to consolidate them. The
Okay.
first part is, what is the best structure for a husband and wife team who own their business and both people contribute to the business operations? And the second part of that is, and they own multiple homes for rent, but want no personal liability or income recorded on personal taxes.
Okay. That's all one question. Um, I just want to repeat back to see if I understand. So best structure for a husband and wife team, um, and the business is owning multiple rental properties, and they don't want to report taxes on their personal income tax returns. Um, so for rental properties, typically, um, something that we commonly do for our clients is create an LLC, for that rental property. So depending on how much you want to diversify your risk, you might have an LLC own each property. But then you have multiple LLCs to manage and maintain and keep alive. So there's, filing fees and maintenance, things that you need to do, and registration and compliance that you need to do for each entity. Um, Typically, I say if the risk profile of the activity is different from another, then separate it into two LLCs so that one doesn't affect the other. But if it's similar and you're okay with, keeping all of that um, risk in one entity together, then you can just have one LLC, or excuse me, one company. So as for the business entity type, if you don't want to file any income on your personal taxes, then you need to be create a C corporation, so a typical like stock corporation, because that's going to file its own tax returns. Um, I feel like there's probably more facts that need to be discussed in this scenario. So that's a very general answer to the facts that were presented. but there's going to be a lot of other considerations because the corporation is such a complex entity to manage. Um, it's you're going to have to weigh the pros and cons of the complexity of a corporation versus whether or not you want to have that income reported on your personal income tax return. So there's a lot of things to consider in making a business entity structure decision. So I think this would be a great question to have a consultation on because there's going to be more factors that come into play than the set of facts that were presented. And I'm going to leave it at that. Hope that answered at least some of it. And if you're a husband and wife team, I guess that was the other factor. Any of the business entity types, whether it's an LLC or a corporation or an S corporation, those would be fine. I think if you want to separate liability from your personal assets, create a business entity. So that's going to mean LLC or corporation.
Thanks, Tammy. I have a follow-on question to the question about bringing on a partner to the LLC.
Oh,
Do all
right.
partners assume an equal authority and responsibility role, or can the agreement dole out varying percentages?
The latter. So it's completely up to you on how you want to um, allocate responsibilities and also benefits from the the partnership. So whether that's distributions or percentage of the income, it could be based on your contributions, your respective contributions to the partnership, um, or your in terms of monetary contributions, or it could be based on time and effort that you're putting into the corporation, or excuse me, the business. But that is also a great question. That would be handled in your ownership agreement, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay,
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then let us get back to the presentation because I know we have a lot to cover.
sure.
And hopefully this one is pretty straightforward. How do you know when you have to update or maintain your LLC state filing?
Ooh, okay. Well, that's going to show on your on one is that they send you a notice. So whoever your registered agent is, on your when you register should send you that notice, and so you'll know when you need to file. It'll depend, what you need to file will depend on your entity type. LLCs need to pay an annual fee. You can also log in to the Virginia SEC database and check to see when your annual report is due. That is a simple one. Okay, well, thanks for the questions, Allie and everyone. I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is a fun one. We'll talk about business entity type with respect to tax classification. So, um, these two concepts are not exactly the same thing, but they often get conflated because the same terms are used when talking about business entity type and tax classification. So I just want to flag that so you're aware that these two things are different, but the terminology is sometimes the same. So whether you're taxed as a corporation or taxed as an LLC or taxed as a sole proprietorship, or whether you are created as a corporation, business, LLC, or your business entity is a sole proprietorship. So just be aware that there is a difference, and we'll dig into this a little bit more. So the second point here, tax treatment. At the federal level may be different from taxation at the state level. This is a very nuanced difference. Your accountant can take care of this, but just as a example, I'm going to talk about LLCs because those are very common. And because they're so flexible, there's a lot of different ways you can tax an LLC. And there's different terminology. So at the state level, LLCs are considered what's known as pass-through entities because the income passes through your business and then onto your personal tax returns. So this means, profits, loss credits, deductions will flow through onto your personal tax return for each member of the LLC. Um, then next, at the federal level, because, well, just to step back a little bit, state level, they will use the term LLC because LLCs are a creation of state law. But at the federal level, the IRS doesn't recognize LLC as a tax classification. It's known as a disregarded entity. So they're not, for tax purposes, they're not viewing the LLC as different from its owner as a taxpayer. So if you are a single member LLC, that means that you are taxed as a sole proprietorship. So your income for your business is going to be reported on your personal tax return, which is your Form 1040 that you file every year. And there's a separate schedule where you report all of your business income and activities. All of it's going to be contained on the Schedule C. If you are a multi-member LLC, you're going to be taxed as a partnership. Um, and that means you file a Form 1065. So the partnership files the 1065, and then the partnership issues Schedule Ks, which tell each partner what their share of the income is, or loss, hopefully not a loss, but the income is that you will file, that each partner will file on their tax returns. So this is just kind of a small illustration. There are many variable factors here. So talking to your CPA about how this is actually going to work for you and your circumstance is going to be important. Um, S corporation election. So many of you have probably heard about an S corporation. It's not actually a business entity type that you can form. It is a tax election. Small business corporations are small business corporation, excuse me, S corporations, and the S is taken from this section of the Internal Revenue Code, so that's why there's the S, but it also conveniently can stand for a small business corporation. So it's a business entity that elects to pass corporate income, losses, deductions, credits through their shareholders for federal tax purposes. And the shareholders of an S corporation will report the flow through of income on their personal tax returns. So it's similar to an LLC in that sense, but it is considered a corporation. And so you use terminology like shareholders that are more in line with a corporation tax entity. Um, in order to be an S corporation, there are certain requirements. So this is not going to be available for everyone. The requirements are that you must be these are just some of them. There are more, but these are the main ones. That if you don't hit these, any one of these, you will not qualify for S corporation status. So you must be a domestic corporation or other eligible business entity. Domestic LLCs are eligible business entities. So LLCs or corporations that are formed as LLCs or corporations at the state level are eligible business, can be eligible business entities. Um, and you can only have allowable shareholders. So there's U.S. citizenship requirements for shareholders. Generally, they need to be individuals, so natural persons, rather than a shareholder can't be like another corporation, for example. But there are some exceptions, like certain trusts and estates that can hold, that can own interests in an S corporation. So, but for the most part, it's going to be individuals, meaning natural persons. Um, so again, they may not be partnerships, corporations, or non-resident alien shareholders. So there's that US citizenship requirement. Um, and then to be a small business corporation, you have to have no more than 100 shareholders, which for a lot of small businesses, that's a lot. So it's pretty high threshold in that regard. And then you have to only have one class of stock. So in a typical corporation, you can have common shares, preferred shares. Those are just some terms that you will often hear in the context of corporations. And so what those are different rights for the shareholders who hold those different types of shares. So you can only have one class of stock, meaning the economic rights that all of the shareholders are eligible for are going to be the same across the board for all of your shareholders. You can't have a difference in voting rights, so you can have non-voting shareholders and voting shareholders, but the economic rights, meaning the rights to the money, is going to have to be equal across shareholders. Um, and then there's this other requirement that certain types of corporations are just straight up not eligible to be S corporations. Um, so if you are eligible and you want to be an S corporation, you can file a Form 2553 with the IRS to make the election. And there are pretty strict requirements in terms of timing of when you make that election. You're going to want to make it uh, early in the year, because there's a time frame by which you need to do it. Because once you make that election, the entire year, you're going to be considered an S corporation. So you don't want to have to backtrack um, all of your accounting for for any period of time. So if you anticipate that this is going to be a decision that you want to make it, look forward and think about the timing of making this election in a new tax year. Okay. I'm gonna pause briefly there to see if there are any questions because that was very dense content before we jump into ownership agreements.
Thank you. And we do actually have a question that applies to ownership agreements queued up for the next section. All right.
Great.
So first question is a lawful permanent resident the same in this context as a green card holder who is eligible for LLC formation?
Lawful permanent resident. A lawful permanent resident is a green card holder. You can um, have ownership interests in an LLC, but not in an S corporation. So so that for green card holders, that's the difference. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So next question, should a business owner file their LLC with their personal taxes or separately? Which would be more beneficial?
Well, so if you are a default uh, pass-through entity, meaning you haven't made any sort of tax election to be taxed differently, if you have an LLC, you do report your income on your personal income tax return. It just goes on a Schedule C. So it's very important to keep all of your books separate for your business activities, separate bank accounts, all of those types of things. So that's all contained um, in, together, and it's not mixed into your personal bank accounts or statements or anything like that. So even though the income gets reported on your personal tax returns, it still needs to be reported for the business as a unit. Um, you can Google Schedule C of your Form 1040 and see what the Schedule C looks like so that you know what you need to report. I think, that's kind of um, just a trick to do is just to figure out what you need to do is look up the form so that you know how to collect that information. If, you know, even if you elect to be taxed as an S corporation, it still gets reported on your personal income tax return. So that is still a pass-through entity. That's if you are an LLC that is taxed as an S corporation. If you don't want to report it on your personal income tax return, you need to create a corporation that's taxed as a C corp. That's the default tax for a corporation is the C corporation tax treatment, and that files its own tax returns.
Thank you. So our next question is, when is the best time from a revenue standpoint or other factors to file the IRS Form 2553 to transition an LLC from a sole proprietorship to an S-Corp with regards to tax and other benefits?
Yeah, this is not going to be a one size fits all answer. It's going to really depend on your specific business and your specific tax circumstances. So this is going to be a decision you make in consultation with your CPA, because there's going to be benefits from a tax perspective, but then also if you make that S corporation election, another aspect of becoming an S corp is that if you do work for the business, you as the owner have to become a W-2 employee. So then you have W-2 income, which is taxes at a different rate from business income. So in combination with those considerations, um, you'll need to talk to your CPA. Also, there's it's a certain income level typically where it is more advantageous to be taxed as an S corporation, but that's going to be different for every business. So there's no one way to answer that question definitively. It's very fact specific.
Similar scenario for a partnership LLC looking to transition to an S-Corp at the beginning of the tax year. Does the paperwork need to be the paperwork need to have a different SCC filing, excuse me, and does it replace the LLC if you had one before the S-Corp?
It doesn't replace the LLC. It is still an LLC. It just gets treated differently for tax purposes. So you don't need to do anything differently with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. It remains an LLC. It is the Form 2553 is a federal tax filing, so that gets filed with the IRS. Um, so hopefully that answers the question.
I think the only part that was missed was can they do this at the beginning of the
Oh,
tax year?
yes, it is advisable to do that at the beginning of the tax year because I mentioned earlier, if you file, there is a time period by which you need to file when you start a new tax year because everything for that tax year is going to be um, under the new tax election. Um, you can make a late election, but generally, you don't want that to be too late. When you make the filing, if you're doing it with your accountant, do make sure that the IRS receives it and you receive a confirmation. Because if you have been keeping your books as an S corporate, you file it and then you don't hear back from the IRS for a long time. Um, make sure that they get it so that you are properly keeping your books for the entire year. Um, but that's an aside. File it for the beginning of the tax year. Thanks, Ellie, for reminding me of that aspect.
Happy to do so. And I think we had one more question, but I think you might have just answered it.
Okay.
So the question briefly was, when is the right time to file tax throughout the year?
So your tax filing deadline, if that's what the question is about, is going to be dependent on your business entity type. That is so it'll be different depending on if you're an LLC versus a corporation. It's going to be either March 15th or um, April 15th. So, but that's an easily Googleable question. Is in terms of income tax returns, but the Form 2553 S corporation election, we've talked about that one already. Okay, well, I'm gonna move on quickly because we're at ownership agreements and we've got about 6 minutes left to the top of the hour. So ownership agreements, these are agreements among the owners of a business that govern the relationship and rights of each owner of the business and sets forth how it will operate. Um, these are called different things depending on the entity type. For LLCs, it is a operating agreement. This is not mandatory. So if you're a single member LLC, you run the whole show, you call all the shots. It's not mandatory for you to have an operating agreement to decide with yourself. But anytime you have business partners, 100%, you need an operating agreement so that you can set expectations properly and define all of these things under this bullet pointed list under the functions here between your business owners. And so for a corporation, it's called a shareholder agreement among the shareholders. For a partnership, it's called a partnership agreement. I will note that for shareholder agreements, while you do have a shareholder agreement that between shareholders, the corporation also will have a set of bylaws to set out like the foundational governance of the corporation. So that's another topic that we're not going to get into, but I just wanted to note that those are kind of two main sets of governing documents. The functions of an ownership agreement, it defines the owner's rights and responsibility. It sets forth how the business is managed. It sets forth rules for finances. So the question earlier about how are things split, um, it could go with, your ownership percentage, but it could also go with, how much in terms of uh, what proportion of the profits you get. It could be in line with your ownership percentage or proportion, or it could be in line with your contribution. So you could lay out all these things in your ownership agreement. It will also set out procedures for entry and exit as a business owner, and then address scenarios like death or disability or separation of an owner. So sometimes this can tie into an estate plan that you have for succession planning, if that's something that you want and need to do. It also can help prevent disputes. I would say, this is one of the first agreements that you should enter into with your business partners, because when you're at the outset of a business, everybody's getting along. You need to decide if there is a dispute, how you're going to settle it, and talk through any issues that might come up through the life of your business at the beginning, because you all are on good terms at that point. It never results well when, you have a dispute and you don't have an agreement to address, like you don't already have an agreement in place to address that scenario or how you're going to resolve the situation. Um, so what this does, it protects relationships of the owners and the business itself. So it's really important to have this agreement done up front. And if there are any issues that you need to hash out, it's best to know about them up front rather than down the line after you've been operating together for some time and have come to big crossroads. So ownership agreements are very important. In terms of liability protection and risk management, we've already talked about how business structure affects personal liability. Some common mistakes that weaken protection. I see this a lot for LLCs, especially single member LLCs, or sometimes even corporations where there's only one shareholder, where there is a commingling of, or just kind of an interchange of use between the owner's name and the company name. You need to keep those two things separate if you do have a separate business entity. So if it's an LLC or corporation, everything needs to be separated from your personal life. That means your business should have its own bank account. It'll have its own employer identification number, which is its federal tax number. It'll use that tax number to open its own bank accounts. Um, Pay bills and enter into contracts. Um, any sort of insurance that's taken out for the business should be in the name of the business. Any intellectual property that's owned by the business that it wants to register should be in the name of the business. Um, and there should be no commingling, because what that does is it it blurs the line between you and the business. And so if there was a claim that came up against the business and you were commingling everything, that claimant can say, well, you're not treating the business as separate from yourself. So that means all of your personal assets could be reached in any sort of lawsuit, or if there's liability to be found. So you definitely don't want that. Make sure everything is separate. Everything that is business related be in the name of the business, and all dealings with the business externally should be in the name of the business. So that is very important in order to preserve the liability protection that you've created using the business entity. Um, Importance of proper documentation and compliance. So we had, once you create a business entity, you need to keep it alive. So you need to file your annual reports, pay your annual fees. Um, if you don't do those things, then the Corporation Commission will automatically terminate your entity status, and your liability protection goes away with that termination. So you do have some grace if you've forgotten, and this happens a lot, you are able to get it reinstated, but not if you've let it go for more than 5 years. So if you just like operating your business and not paying attention to maintaining your entity status, or in good standing, then that could be a problem. Um, Other compliance includes, tax registration, paying your taxes in the jurisdiction, so subnational jurisdictions, state, county, all of those taxes, and getting your business licenses, and basically just making sure that you're in compliance and keeping your entity in good standing with the corporate regulation authorities and then also the tax authorities. And then the proper documentation. This is going to vary by entity type. If you need um, corporate meeting minutes, that's for a corporation versus, really nothing at all if you're a sole proprietorship. But if you do have a more complex business entity structure, then you're going to need the proper documentation to keep it maintained. Um, I see that we are over time, so I'm going to skip over some of these things. And these are you know, just general examples of transitions that you could make. I think we've covered a lot of the scenarios through just the business entity types and then some of the questions that have come up. I do want to touch on this slide. I know you're going to get the slide. So in terms of getting ready for funding, lenders and investors, even family members might want this type of information. So if you want to be ready for funding, you need to be ready to do due diligence. That means all your corporate and organization and capital structure are in place. You are in compliance with all the regulatory requirements. You have your financial information in order. Finances are super, super important. If that's not a skill set that you have inherently or went to school for, take some financial classes or get a good advisor. Um, and even if you have a good advisor, you still need to know as a business owner your finances and understand the basics so that you have some fluency in your business finances because that's how you're going to know how to make decisions about your business. And people who are looking to invest in your business are going to look at your books. Tax information, make sure you're up to date on your tax returns. Um, Contracts. Are your contracts protective of the business? Employment matters. You need to make sure, like small businesses, employment liability is the hugest area of liability for small businesses. So compliance with employment laws is very important. Intellectual property, making sure your IP is protected, and registered where it needs to be. Um, Investors will make sure because your IP is a way of monetizing your business. So that's very important that you have secure rights in your IP. And then real and personal property of the business, making sure that's all in order, having insurance for your business, and then also making sure that you're not in any sort of trouble with the law in terms of litigation or third parties, and then compliance with the laws in general. So those are some very like important aspects, which just covers a lot of your business. So if you're going through a checklist before getting ready for funding, these are the different areas that you should be aware of. I'm going to skip over this, but 'cause we've talked about a little bit of this already. Key takeaways. A structure is a strategic growth decision. As we've talked about, it can set you up um, for different avenues, but it doesn't mean that once you choose a structure that you're stuck with it forever. You can transition from one to another relatively easily. So long as you've kept up and properly maintained your entity, it makes it much easier to transition to a different structure. So all of the things that I've talked about that I mentioned in that due diligence list, make sure you keep up with them. So structure is important, but you can always change it. Um, Ownership agreements and legal compliance, we've already talked about the importance of those different aspects. and then planning for financing and partnerships. I think, due to some of the questions, some of you are already thinking about those scenarios for your business. And then, as I said, you can revisit your structure and change it as it evolves. So it's not stuck in stone forever. I don't think we have any time for Q&A. I mean, I can stay on if folks want to stay on. But I will just pause
We
it there.
do we do have some time for Q&A, and
Okay.
we do have some questions. So it's truly up to you how long you'd like to stay. We have until 1:30 or
Okay.
thereabouts, and folks are welcome to stay on or if they have other commitments.
Okay. Well, for the folks who need to leave, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. It was a pleasure to have you, and good luck with your business. I know there's some housekeeping that you all wanted to do on your side, Lena, in terms of how to contact you all. And then we can switch it back to Q&A for those who can stay. Does that sound okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
We can remind people that we left our contact information in the chat if you are interested for one-on-one advising, and we couldn't get to your question, and you might have to drop off. And I would like to thank you, Tammy, for your time and such a great, fruitful presentation that we hope to repeat in 2026. And just wishing everyone very happy holidays, and we can move on with some of the questions that we have.
Thanks, Lena, and thank you, Tammy. All right. So first question is there a a resource of good partnership questions to explore? Something along the lines of ask these questions before moving in together.
This is a great question. I don't have a great answer for it. Um, I think, you know, it depends on where you are in your business, whether or not you've already started a business and are looking to take on business partners, or if you're looking for a business partner to start something new with. Um, I think it'll depend on what kind of questions you're gonna want to ask a potential partner. I know there are partner like kind of founder matching services out there, so perhaps they might have questions for consideration. Unfortunately, I don't have a good one off the top of my head. Sorry.
All good. This may also be something that some of our advisors are able to cover in those one-on-one sessions.
Sure. Yeah.
Next, next question. How and which type of entity is suitable for someone who wants to start an IT service consultancy here in Virginia, and having someone who will help support for the same entity from offshore? Is it possible to structure it as a two-member entity with one here in the US and another from offshore legally? If so, how and what are the tax implications?
So, thank you for that question. Um, I would typically say, you know, the most flexible business entity type is an LLC. So I would look at that first, to see if that is, a viable option. And while, the offshore person, I would need more details about that person and whether they are a citizen or of the US, or whether they are and that goes to the tax question. So where their portion of the income is going to be subject to tax. So again, I'm not an accountant, and even a lot of accountants, if there are international tax issues, that's kind of a niche area as well. So not all accountants would know about international tax, and it could depend on where that person is and would be taxed, if not in the US. And then I have other questions about, is this person going to be abroad indefinitely, or are they coming back to the US? So I think this is a question for a one-on-one consultation because there's a lot more facts that I would need to know in order to properly answer that question. But those are the types of things to consider. But generally, just because you are overseas doesn't mean that you cannot be a member of an LLC.
Wonderful. Next question. If you have two LLC companies that have not been making money yet and you file on taxes, would that become a problem with the IRS if revenue is slowed to come?
Um, well, that, this actually takes me back to law school. So there is the IRS, where this might become a problem is if you've reported losses for a long time. Um, and I'm not 100% sure of the threshold in terms of what might constitute a long time that would raise flags with the IRS. But if you're just reporting losses for a long time, then the IRS might say, this is a hobby. It's not an actual business. You're just spending money and trying to get offset your income with these losses. So it's a hobby, not an actual business. But I think if you're genuinely, running it as a business and trying to make a profit, um, there shouldn't be an issue. And you can prove that, that you're treating it as a legitimate business. There are other factors that the IRS would look at in terms of determining whether it is improper to continue reporting losses. Um, but not all businesses are going to make money, especially not right out of the gate. You're going to have, it's the reason why a lot of businesses don't make it past 5 years. It's hard to start a business and to make it profitable. So I don't see that factor in and of itself as problematic.
Thank you. Our next question is, what business structure do you recommend if someone has several different business interests in very different areas, such as selling goods and offering services and consulting?
Mm. This is a great question. So I kind of alluded to it earlier when I was hurriedly talking about the LLCs for rental properties. So this question, I get asked this a lot, but the answer is generally, look at the different types of activities and whether the risk of those activities in terms of the liability exposure is relatively the same or if they're dramatically different. So if you're selling goods, for example, um, there's liability with respect to products. So, if somebody hurts themselves using the product that could be a potential exposure there. Versus consulting, where you're just, mostly sitting at a computer or a desk and, it's knowledge work. You don't have a lot of hard assets. You're not sending things to people that could potentially hurt them. It's pretty low risk. The highest liability is the professional liability. You give some bad advice or you don't do something that you've committed to doing. That's professional liability. So that liability, um, and risk is very different from products liability and could be different from a service where you are, making food for someone or, catering or, providing a personal service like hair. Um, so you got to look at the different risk profiles of each activity and determine whether or not they should be separated from each other. Because if you have them all in one business, then they're all in the same pot. So the risk from one activity could take down your other activity. If you don't want that to happen, then separate them out into different buckets, i.e., different entities, so that they're insulated from each other.
Excellent. All right, so we have two more questions in the queue.
Okay.
Next one is, if your corporate number has expired, i.e. past 5 years, what would be the best way to get it back, or do you need to get a new IP number?
So I'm assuming this is referring to the SCC ID number, which is tied to your business entity registration. Unfortunately, once it's past 5 years, the Virginia's, and this is specific to Virginia, this is Virginia's rules. For other jurisdictions, it's a little bit different. So it'll depend on the jurisdiction. But for Virginia, if it's 5 years past the when it was auto revoked by the SEC, then you cannot reinstate it. So this kind of creates some complications in terms of like the taxes and filing the business entity and all that because that business entity no longer exists. You would need the help of, your team, your accountant, and a lawyer, probably to work together to figure out what the best path forward would be. You probably need to create a new business entity because you want that liability protection. But you're going to have a gap between when it could not be revoked or it could not be when it was revoked rather, and when you create the new entity in terms of liability protection. So there is some exposure there for you, but I would say, consult with an attorney. This would be a good one-on-one counseling topic to try to, identify what exactly happened and, how big the exposure is and how to mitigate that. And then also, on the tax side, if anything needs to be corrected in terms of the filings because it would no longer be accurate based on the entity no longer being in existence. So come in for a consultation on this one. It's a little bit more complex.
Thank you. And our last question, I think is another good one. Do you know of a good book that talks about an LLC bringing on partners and the transition to LLC taxed as an S-Corp?
Oh boy. Um, I read a lot of law books, so they're not necessarily for general consumption. Let's see. I feel like there's, for really general basics, there's like the NOLO series. Like you can find, from the big publishers some series of books on topics. I would not rely on the internet because there's all sorts of information out there and it's hard to tell which information is going to be applicable to you. I mean, I think the best thing to do is just to go get one-on-one advice on these things. Capital pathways, of course. There's the small business um, center, like there's the Small Business Administration has a number of um, offices throughout the country, Virginia included, and there's one at George Mason too. Um, that provide services to businesses to get kind of that one-on-one advice. That will give you a good start. I don't know that, and then there's webinars that you can attend. I would do local because any of the books out there are going to be like very general, like high level that are going to be applicable to like as many people as possible. That means it's not going to be specific enough for your region for the most part. So if you go to, the agencies, that, SB DC, Capital Pathways are like the Small Women's Business Center, Small Women's Small Business Center in Virginia. There's also, the DC Bar has pro bono resources. There's an organization called SCORE. I would say, go get one-on-one um, advice on these topics that you're interested in, um, because that's going to be more applicable to your situation. The books are going to be very general, and you could get the same information on the websites that you find, on, that the government agencies have information. So, um, again, sorry, I don't have a good like go-to book that I recommend to people. I think, one-on-one advice is such a good resource to have And if you have that access to that, I would go take advantage of that.
Thank you for that little shout out, Tammy. And we got not a question, but a comment saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. Tammy is a great presenter and they learned so much. And I'd just like to echo that from our end here at Capital Pathways and say thank you for joining us today and sharing your time. We will be sharing all of the slides and recording of this session in an email that goes out in about a week as a kind of a follow-up. And as a reminder, if you're interested in that one-on-one no-cost advising, the information is dropped in the chat, or you can email me directly at ajohn216@gmail.edu, and we will get you connected with an advisor.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Allie, and thanks, Capital Pathways. Have a great holiday, everyone.